A tomb guard saw something impossible during his midnight watch at Arlington National Cemetery. A figure in an old military uniform that shouldn't exist. But what he discovered about this mysterious soldier changed everything he thought he knew about duty, loss, and letting go. His response to what happened next left everyone who witnessed it in tears. So who was this figure? And what did the guard do that moved an entire crowd to silence? Before we reveal the truth, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning fog at Arlington hangs different than anywhere else, thicker, heavier, like it's carrying more than just moisture. From the PTOAC, it rolls between the white headstones in waves, turning the cemetery into something between memory and dream, where the living walk among stories that refuse to stay buried. Specialist Gabriel Price knew that fog well. He'd walked through it for 14 months, 21 steps at a time, rifle balanced against his shoulder with the kind of precision that only comes from doing the same thing perfectly over and over until it becomes prayer. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood behind him like a promise carved in marble, clean white stone that caught every ray of light. Even on days when the sun barely showed, Gabriel could recite the inscription from memory. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier, known but to God. He'd read those words maybe 1,000 times, but this morning, they felt heavier, somehow more personal. He'd earned the Tomb Guard badge after weeks of the most demanding training the Army offers. Most don't make it past the first month. They wash out because they can't handle the pressure, the perfection, the absolute silence that duty demands. Gabriel's class started with 37 candidates. Only 4 made it through. The selection process broke men in ways they didn't expect, not physically, though the physical demands were brutal, but mentally, the constant scrutiny, the zero tolerance for error, the weight of knowing that every movement would be judged against a standard that had been maintained for decades. Gabriel had watched grown men cry during uniform inspections that lasted hours, searching for flaws that would send them back to regular duty. But Gabriel understood something the washouts didn't. This wasn't about perfection for its own sake. This was about becoming worthy of standing guard over America's unknown dead. Every pressed seam, every polished button, every measured step was an offering, a way of saying that the sacrifice of the unknown soldiers mattered enough to demand your absolute best. Gabriel wasn't most people. Before Arlington, he'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Helmand Province, the kind of place where silence meant survival and noise got you killed. He'd learned discipline in a place where forgetting it cost lives, where young soldiers aged years and months and came home carrying invisible weight that never quite settled right. He'd also learned to carry weight that didn't show on any scale. This particular morning, something felt different, not wrong exactly, just heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Gabriel had developed instincts about these things during his time downrange. Combat does that to you. Makes you notice things others miss, the way shadows fall, the way silence can have texture to it. He reached the end of his 21 steps, executed the crisp turn that had been drilled into muscle memory, and began the walk back. His boots struck marble with metronomic precision. The tourists gathered along the chain barriers watched in respectful silence, phones held low, voices dropped to whispers. Even the children seemed to understand they were witnessing something sacred. That's when he first sensed it. Not saw it, sensed it. Someone was watching him differently than the others, not with the casual curiosity of a tourist or the grateful reverence of a veteran. This was something else, something that made the space between his shoulder blades prickle with awareness. The same feeling he used to get on patrol when someone had eyes on him from a rooftop or tree line. Gabriel didn't break stride, didn't turn his head. That wasn't how this worked, but his peripheral vision caught movement. Beyond the rope line, a figure standing apart from the small crowd, perfectly still, in a way that reminded Gabriel of his own training, military bearing, even from a distance. The morning passed like every other. Tourists came and went in respectful waves. An elderly veteran placed a small American flag near the base of the tomb, his arthritic hands trembling slightly as he stepped back and rendered a careful salute. The changing of the guard happened with ceremonial perfection. Every movement choreographed, every step measured, every gesture carrying the weight of tradition. Gabriel handed off his post and walked to the locker room, but that feeling of being watched stayed with him like a shadow. That night in the barracks, Gabriel sat on his bunk polishing his dress shoes with slow, methodical strokes. The rhythm helped him think. Round him, the other guards went through their evening routines with the same quiet discipline they brought to everything else. No horseplay, no loud conversations, Just the sound of leather being buffed, uniforms being pressed, equipment being maintained to impossible standards. The old guard barracks had its own culture, quieter than regular army, more focused. These weren't just soldiers. They were men and women who had volunteered for duty that demanded perfection every single day, where a single mistake could dishonor something bigger than themselves. You ever feel like someone's watching you out there? Gabriel asked. Specialist Camden, who was inspecting a uniform blouse nearby, checking every seam for loose threads. Camden glanced up with a half smile. You mean besides the tourists and a few 100,000 dead soldiers? No, I mean just one. Someone specific. Camden's expression shifted slightly. The casual humor faded, replaced by something more serious. What did he look like? Gabriel's hand stopped moving on the leather. How'd you know it was a he? Because, Camden said, lowering his voice and glancing around the barracks to make sure no one else was listening. It always is. And he's always wearing dress greens from about 40 years ago. Am I right? Gabriel stared at him. You've seen him too, a few times, usually around November. Always alone, never moves. Just watches. Camden went back to his uniform. But his movements were more deliberate now. Most of us have seen him at some point. We just don't talk about it much. Another voice chimed in from the far corner. Specialist Rodriguez, polishing his brass with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. First time I saw him, I thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Asked for a psych eval and everything. What happened? Gabriel asked. Rodriguez didn't look up from his work. Doc said I was fine. Stress levels normal. No signs of hallucinations or delusions. Told me to get more sleep and drink less coffee. A pause. Thing is, I already knew I wasn't crazy. You know how you know when something's real versus when your mind's playing tricks. This was real. Camden nodded slowly. That's the thing nobody talks about in the manual. This place, it's different. You spend enough time here, walking that line, standing guard over the unknown dead, and you start to understand that some boundaries aren't as solid as people think. From across the room, Sergeant Keller spoke without looking up from his paperwork. He only shows up for the ones carrying something heavy. Gabriel felt it. His throat tightened. What do you mean? Keller finally looked up. His eyes were steady, understanding the kind of look that passes between soldiers who've both seen too much. You know what I mean. Price. The room went quiet in that particular way military spaces do when someone's touched on something real, something that matters. The other guards didn't stop what they were doing, but their movements became more careful, more respectful of the silence. Gabriel did know what he meant. Marcus Clay, squad leader in Helmand, 28 years old, Detroit native who could make anyone laugh, even in the middle of a firefight. Called Gabriel choirboy because he never swore, never complained, just did the job with the kind of quiet competence that made other soldiers feel safer just having him around. Clay had been Gabriel's mentor during his first deployment, taught him how to read the terrain, how to spot IED signatures, how to keep his squad alive in a place where the wrong step could end everything. More than that, he'd taught Gabriel what it meant to lead by example, to carry yourself like the men under your command deserved better than your worst day. Leadership isn't about being the toughest guy in the room, Clay had said during one of their late-night talks in the fob. It's about being the most reliable. Your men need to know that when everything goes sideways, you'll still be thinking clearly, still making the right calls, still putting them first. Gabriel had taken those lessons to heart, applied them every day for 8 months until they became second nature, until he could read Clay's signals from across a compound, anticipate his orders before they were given, move through dangerous ground with the kind of confidence that only comes from absolute trust in your leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd learned those lessons so well, yet couldn't save the man who taught them. Gabriel had been checking a vehicle's rear axle, just routine maintenance in what should have been a quiet sector. The RPG came from nowhere, a flash of heat and pressure that turned the world into ringing silence and choking dust. The truck had been their lifeline back to base, a simple brake check before the convoy rolled out. Gabriel was underneath, flashlight in his teeth, when the world exploded above him. The chassis absorbed most of the blast, probably saved his life. But Clay had been topside, scanning for threats, doing what good leaders do, putting himself in the most dangerous position so his men could work safely. By the time Gabriel crawled through the smoke and debris, Clay was down, bleeding into the dirt from wounds that even the best combat medic couldn't fix him. Gabriel had held pressure, called for medevac, done everything right, everything except get him home alive. Clay's last words still echoed. Get them home. Price, not dramatic, not philosophical. Just the kind of simple, direct order Clay always gave. Take care of the men. Finish the mission. Get everyone home safe. Gabriel had carried those words for 3 years now through redeployment, through the slow process of learning how to be a civilian again, through tomb guard selection when he decided he needed duty that meant something. Not his penance exactly, but his purpose, a way to serve something bigger than his own guilt. Now this figure, this watcher, this man in an old uniform who only appeared to guards carrying something heavy. Gabriel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the quiet breathing of sleeping soldiers round him. He thought about Clay's laugh, about the way he'd always checked on his men before checking on himself, about the promise Gabriel had made at a grave in Kentucky to never let anyone forget. What kind of soldier Marcus Clay had been? The questions wouldn't let him sleep. Who was this figure? Why was he watching? And why did Gabriel feel like he was being measured, somehow tested by eyes that understood weight, in ways most people never would? The second encounter happened during the midnight shift. The cemetery after hours is a different world. No tourists, no crowds, no sounds except the distant hum of traffic on the parkway and the soft whisper of wind through the oak trees that line Memorial Drive. Gabriel preferred the night watches. Something about the darkness made the ceremony feel more like what it was supposed to be. Not a performance, but a vigil. The fog had rolled in thick that night, cutting visibility down to maybe 20 feet in any direction. The kind of weather that makes sound carry strangely, where your own footsteps seem to echo from somewhere else. The floodlights created halos in the mist, turning the marble plaza into something otherworldly. Gabriel was on his fourth pass when he saw him clearly for the first time. The man stood just inside the rope barrier, not crossing into the sacred space around the tomb itself, but closer than any civilian was supposed to be after hours. Military bearing, despite civilian clothes, mid-40s. Gabriel guessed. Sharp jawline, gray eyes that seemed to catch the light differently than they should. The kind of stillness that comes from serious training, from years of learning how to be invisible when you need to be. But it was the uniform that made Gabriel's breath catch. Dress greens, Vietnam era. By the look of them, the old-style Class A's with the high collar and brass buttons pressed sharp enough to cut yourself on. Shoes polished to mirror brightness, despite the damp air. A military cap held in hands that gripped it like something precious, like something earned. Gabriel didn't break stride. He couldn't. But as he reached the center point of his walk, the man did something that made time. Hiccup. He raised his hand to his forehead. Not a casual wave. Not a tourist's attempt at military courtesy. A real salute, crisp, precise, held for exactly the right amount of time before being lowered with the same deliberate control. The kind of salute you see in old photographs. The kind Gabriel's grandfather had taught him when he was 10 years old, before anyone thought he'd ever need to know it for real, before anyone imagined he'd end up standing guard over the unknown dead. In the middle of a Virginia night, Gabriel completed his turn and began the walk back. The man was still there, still at attention, still perfectly motionless in the swirling fog, not challenging Gabriel's authority, not testing his discipline, just acknowledging soldier to soldier. On the next pass, as Gabriel reached the center mark, something made him stop. He'd never broken stride on the plaza. Not once in 14 months. It was the kind of thing that could end a guard's career. The kind of breach of protocol that simply didn't happen. The old guard didn't make mistakes. They didn't have moments of weakness or lapses in judgment. But Gabriel stopped, not dramatically, not suddenly. Just a smooth deceleration until he stood perfectly still on the marble, rifle at port arms, eyes forward. The way you stop when you realize something important is happening and you need to pay attention. The man stepped forward. Just one pace, then another. They stood maybe 10 feet apart now, guard and figure, separated by regulations and something deeper than rules. The fog swirled between them like a curtain that couldn't decide whether to rise or fall. Gabriel felt words rise in his throat before he could stop them. Was it enough? His voice barely disturbed the fog, but the weight of the question cracked something open inside him. He wasn't asking about ceremony, or duty, or the perfection of his 14-month vigil. He was asking about Clay, about whether carrying these words, this guilt, this perfect silence had meant anything at all, about whether standing guard over the unknown dead could somehow balance the scales for the known dead he hadn't been able to save. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand again. This time, not quite a salute. Fingers touched his forehead. then moved away in a gesture Gabriel recognized from a dozen military funerals, the final salute, the one that says goodbye and thank you and well done, all at once. When Gabriel blinked, the fog was clearing. When he blinked again, he was alone on the plaza. But something had changed, not in the world around him but in the weight he'd been carrying. Like a burden shared becomes a burden halved. Like a question asked in the right place at the right time sometimes gets answered without words. Gabriel finished his shift in silence, but for the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. The next day, Gabriel found himself in the regimental archives, a small room tucked away from the tourist areas, behind the administrative building, where most visitors never thought to look, filled with dusty file cabinets and boxes of old photographs, the kind of place where military history gets stored and mostly forgotten. The room smelled like old paper and floor wax. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of manila folders and cardboard storage boxes labeled with years that felt like ancient history. He'd filed a request to review casualty records from Vietnam, the kind of paperwork that usually takes weeks to process, moving through channels at bureaucratic speed, often getting lost in the shuffle. But somehow, this one had moved through into days, expedited without explanation, approved without question. Gabriel flipped through black and white photographs mounted on cardstock, scanning faces of soldiers from a war his father barely remembered. Young men in uniforms that looked like costumes now, all sharp angles and serious expressions. Boys who'd grown up too fast in places that aged you in ways that didn't show on the outside. Each photo told a story. Jenkins, Robert T. Kia, K. San Martinez, Louisa M. Mia, Cambodia Williams, James D. Waya. Purple Heart went home with pieces missing that couldn't be replaced. Then he saw him. Same jawline, same steady eyes, same slight crease across the bridge of the nose from squinting against too much sun. In too many bad places. The caption underneath made Gabriel's hands shake. Clay, Marcus J. Sargent, 75th Infantry, MIA, body never recovered, Ben Din Province. Status, unknown. Not his Clay. A different Clay, from a different war, a different time. But the name hit like a physical blow, like stepping on something sharp in the dark. Gabriel read the file twice before the pieces clicked together. Marcus Clay, Vietnam. Missing in action. Body never recovered. Disappeared during a patrol in 1969 and simply never came back. No grave marker, no final resting place, no family notification. Beyond the standard telegram that began with, "The Secretary of the Army regrets to inform you," one of the thousands who simply vanished into the jungle and never came home. One of the unknown soldiers who might be lying in the tomb Gabriel guarded every day. The weight of understanding settled over him like lead. This wasn't about his guilt over losing his squad leader in Afghanistan. This was about something bigger. About all the soldiers who never made it home. About all the names that got lost in the bureaucracy of war, filed away in folders that nobody opened anymore. About carrying the memory of people who had no one left to remember them. The file contained more details. Clay had been a good soldier, volunteered for a second tour, led from the front, died trying to get his men out of an ambush that went bad. The kind of story that played out 1,000 times in a war where good men died for complicated reasons that never made sense to the people who loved them. Gabriel closed the file with careful hands. His own Marcus Clay had a grave in Kentucky, had family who visited it, had a name on a headstone that said he'd been loved. This Marcus Clay had none of that, just a guard who'd noticed him, who'd acknowledged him, who'd finally asked if it was enough. That evening, Gabriel walked to the small chapel near the administrative building. It was quiet inside, lit by candles and the soft glow of stained glass windows that turned ordinary light into something sacred. An offering bowl sat near the altar, filled with folded notes, challenge coins, and small mementos left by visitors who needed to leave something behind. Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper. A field report from Afghanistan, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. His Clay's name was listed in the casualty section, along with the details that would never capture what kind of man he'd been. At the bottom, in faded handwriting, were the words Clay had written the day before he died. "This war doesn't end when we leave it. It ends when we remember why we came." Gabriel placed the report in the offering bowl. Not as an ending, but as a beginning, a way of carrying both Clays, his Clay, and this Clay, without being crushed by the weight of them. A way of understanding that some duties are bigger than personal guilt, that some Vigils are kept not for the living, but for the dead who have no one else to remember them. He knelt for just a moment, not long, just enough to whisper two words, "I remember." When he stood and turned to leave, Gabriel felt lighter than he had in 3 years. Not because the burden was gone, but because he finally understood what it was for. Not penance, not guilt, but purpose. The kind of duty that extends beyond the living to encompass all the souls who'd served and never made it home. Gabriel's final week as a tomb guard passed without incident. No fog, no figures, no midnight encounters with soldiers from other wars. Just the steady rhythm of duty, performed with the same precision he'd brought to every shift for 14 months. On his last night, as he handed over the post to his replacement, a young specialist from Ohio who carried himself with the kind of nervous pride that comes from earning the badge, Gabriel did something he'd never done before. He looked up at the inscription on the tomb one final time. Not reading it, he knew every letter by heart, but really seeing it, understanding it in a way he hadn't before. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known, but to God, not just one soldier, all of them, every unknown, every missing, every name lost to time and bureaucracy and the fog of war, every Marcus Clay from every conflict who died trying to get his people home. Gabriel had spent 14 months walking that line, thinking he was honoring his guilt. Turns out, he'd been honoring something much bigger. After his discharge ceremony, Gabriel transferred to Fort Drum, started working with new recruits, fresh-faced kids from small towns who thought they knew what they were signing up for. He taught them the basics, how to maintain their weapons, how to read terrain, how to stay alive in places where staying alive wasn't guaranteed. He never talked about the tomb, never mentioned the figure in the fog, or the files in the archives, or the moment when understanding hit like lightning in a clear sky. But his soldiers could tell he'd been somewhere that mattered, could sense the weight he carried and the way he'd learned to carry it without being crushed. Every November, he came back, never in uniform, never announced, just another visitor standing among the tourists, watching younger guards walk the line he'd walked for 14 months, watching them learn what he'd learned about duty that extends beyond the self, about vigils that honor the unknown dead. Last year, Gabriel stood near the eastern wall as sunset painted the marble gold and red. A small crowd had gathered for the evening ceremony, had drawn a small crowd. Among them was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, holding her grandfather's hand with the careful attention children reserve for important moments they don't quite understand but somehow know are significant. The old man had veteran written in the way he stood, the way he watched the ceremony with eyes that had seen too much, but still believed in the importance of remembering. The girl asked quiet questions. He answered in whispers, pointing out details that mattered, explaining, without explaining, why this place demanded their best behavior. After the ceremony ended, the girl broke away from her grandfather. She walked to the tomb and knelt down, placing a folded piece of paper and a single white flower at the base of the marble. Her movements were careful, reverent, like she understood she was part of something bigger than herself. Gabriel couldn't read what she'd written, but he saw the careful, childlike handwriting, the way she looked up at the inscription, with the kind of understanding that has nothing to do with age, and everything to do with recognizing sacred ground when you're standing on it. As she stood and walked back to her grandfather, she caught Gabriel's eye just for a moment. She nodded, small, serious, the way you acknowledge someone when you recognize them even if you've never met, the way soldiers acknowledge each other across distances that can't be measured in miles. Gabriel nodded back. That was all, but it was enough, because somewhere in that moment, Gabriel finally understood what the figure in the fog had been trying to tell him, what every guard who'd walked that line had eventually learned. You don't carry the dead because you failed them, you carry them because no one else will. You walk that line not to ease your guilt but to ensure they're never truly forgotten, to stand witness for the unknown, to keep vigil for the missing, to honor the fallen by refusing to let their sacrifice become invisible. And sometimes, if you're very quiet and very lucky, they walk with you, just to let you know they made it home after all. So here's the question. When you're carrying weight that belongs to someone else, how do you know when you've carried it far enough? And in a world that moves too fast to remember most things, who's responsible for carrying the names that get left behind? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations matter more than you might realize. If this story reminded you why these ceremonies matter, why these guards stand in all weather, at all hours, protecting something more important than stone and marble, hit that like button. Asterisk helps more than you know. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the extraordinary men and women who guard our most sacred traditions. And if you know someone who needs to understand the difference between performing duty and embodying it, share this video with them. Your next Tomb Guard story is waiting on your screen right now. Click it and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Some things are worth carrying, even when, especially when, no one else remembers.